Alaikum wa rahmatullahi. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Halima. I'll be one of your co-hosts for this evening, inshallah. I'm just going to pass the mic to Fawzia, who's going to recite Surah Al-Fatiha before we start.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, thanks for joining us. Um, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا صراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين.
Barakallah khair. So, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to the Muslim Council of Britain's African Islamic History series. Since 1997, the Muslim Council of Britain has been working to unite and to empower our diverse Muslim community across the UK, guided by a vision of service and shared purpose. In this specific series, we begin with our second episode, The History of Islam in Nigeria, joined by our esteemed guest, Mustafa Briggs. But before we dive in, let's just ask, why are we doing this?
We believe that to shape our future, we must first learn from the lesson of the past. And what better place to start than with the rich and vibrant history of Africa, its nations, its tribes, and its people. Here in Britain, more than 10% Muslims are black, with roots stretching from the Caribbean islands of Trinidad and Tobago to the southern tip of Africa, from Madagascar in the Indian Ocean to the cities of Europe, and of course, right here in the UK. So why is the Muslim Council of Britain leading this series during Black History Month? Because this month is about standing firm in pride and power. And as Allah reminds us in the Quran, O mankind, we created you from a male and a female and made you into people and tribes so that you may know one another. This is our story, our shared heritage. So join us as we learn from the past, reflect on the present, and envision a stronger and united future together. Because if we were to realize our vision 2050, we must begin to reconnect to our roots and our history.
So just a bit of housekeeping. Please type any questions that you have into the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. And we'll try and group the questions, and just apologies in advance if we're not able to answer all the questions in the limited time that we have. The event is also being recorded and it will be uploaded onto the MCB YouTube channel, inshallah. So you're welcome to view it again at a later time.
So I'd like to speak to you about Zamzam Foundation. We have organized our webinar series for Black History Month in partnership with Zamzam Foundation in the UK, and it feels really great to have them as our sponsor. So why do I say that? Because what we're trying to do is honor African Islamic history and celebrate the culture and resilience and resourcefulness of African Muslims of today. So what better way could you ask for a modern African leading the indigenous Muslim charities? We actually want to introduce two charities here.
So one of the charities is the Zamzam Foundation, which is based in Mogadishu, but with 8 offices that are dotted around the country. Zamzam Foundation provides emergency aid to those affected by conflict, drought, and floods. It helps the poorest families to face the challenges of climate change and lift themselves out of poverty. It works in Somaliland and Puntland in the north and Jubaland in hard to reach parts of the far south, and in pretty much all of the areas in between. Zamzam Foundation was established in 1992, which was set up by Somalis for Somalis to support the most vulnerable during an unprecedented humanitarian crisis following the collapse of the central government and the severe famine that then followed. 33 years later, it has established itself as the country's biggest charity, supporting a record 2.6 million Somalis last year alone.
So the other organization we want to highlight is Zamzam Foundation UK, based in London, and it was launched a year ago. So Zamzam UK is the result of an innovative partnership between Zamzam Foundation in Somalia and an established UK registered charity you may have heard of called Somali Relief and Development Forum, which was founded by UK Somali Diaspora Organization in 2011. Because of Zamzam Foundation UK, Muslims and the Somali diaspora in the UK and internationally can now easily support the life-saving and life-changing work of Zamzam Foundation by making donations via Zamzam UK website. So the needs are huge. Over 10 million Somalis are living in extreme poverty. 8 million don't have access to clean water and sanitation. 6 million depend on humanitarian aid to survive, and more than 3.6 million children are out of school because of poverty, conflict, and displacement. Zamzam Foundation and Zamzam Foundation UK are up to these challenges. In its 33 years history, Zamzam has built 8 hospitals and over 150 schools. It has drilled over 180 boreholes. Last year, its Ramadan and Qurbani food distribution reached 1.3 million Somalis. It built 8 new schools, provided clean water for over 970,000 people, and provided healthcare for 182,000 through 28 facilities.
So we do have a short video for you all to watch that shows the importance of the work that Zamzam health centers are doing, whose very existence is under threat because of international aid cuts. There will also be a link to the video in the group chat in case you want to watch it at a later date.
Expecting her second child, she already has 2 healthy children, born safely at Kalimo Health Center, with support from professional midwife. But Kanimo is one of the 2 health centers that will have to close within weeks unless we can find funds to keep them open.
MashaAllah, waa noola gargaaray, daawo waa ka qaadanaa, ilmaha waa noola tallaalaa, waa ku umalnaa, waa noola gargaaraa marka waxaan u baahanahay inaan maxaan kuu sheegaa aan nagala xirin isbitaalka.
Our health center in Kanimo and Gololi are lifeline for 51,000 people in around 94 villages, treating malnutrition, vaccinating children, delivering babies safely. Donations before the end of 2025 will be matched pound for pound by Lady Fatima Trust, up to a total of £25,000. Please donate today and help us save lives.
Thank you for watching. Let's please consider Zamzam Foundation UK as a charity worthy of our support, both for Sadaqah and Zakat donations. You can support the All Mothers Matter appeal featured in the video by scanning the QR code. So there's a QR code there. We are now displaying, which will take you straight to the donation page on the Zamzam UK website. There's also a Just Giving page for the appeal that has just been set up. So when you donate to All Mothers Matter, it will be matched pound for pound by the Lady Fatima Trust for up to £25,000 on all eligible donations between now and the end of December, while funds last. So that means the value and positive impact of your donations will be doubled at no cost to you. So let's also follow Zamzam UK on social media to help them build up a community that supports the UK and spread of the fantastic organization, spread the word of the fantastic organization. You find them on Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube.
Okay, Jazakallah khair for that, Fawzia. So we'll now move on to the segment from our guest speaker, inshallah. So today we are joined by Mustapha Briggs, who is a world-renowned author and speaker from London. He studied Arabic and international relations at Westminster and then went on to study at SOAS and Al-Azhar University in Cairo, whilst also training with scholars across Africa and the Middle East. Mustafa is best known for his groundbreaking lecture series, Beyond Bilal, Black History in Islam, which he's delivered at leading universities worldwide, including Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, and Yale. He's also the author of 2 Amazon bestsellers, Beyond Bilal and Islam and the Making of the Modern World. His work shines a light on the deep connections between Islam, Africa, and global history that inspires audiences from all around the world. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Mustafa Briggs.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah wa salatu bismillah. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Alhamdulillah, it's a pleasure to join you all here today again for this these amazing sessions that have been going on, which have been detailing different aspects of Black history, especially regarding the fact that this is Black History Month, and so this is a time in which this history is going to be put into focus. And so today, I have been asked to speak about the history of Islam in Nigeria. And this is something that I'm extremely interested in talking about. This is something that I've also written about extensively in my book, Beyond Bilal, Black History in Islam. And so, inshallah, hopefully, I'll be able to provide a brief overview. So, keeping in mind the time constraints, keeping in mind the fact that I don't want to bore people, especially because I don't have a presentation and it's just going to be me speaking, and keeping in mind as well the fact that, our attention spans are also very low nowadays due to social media and everything. I'm going to summarize and give a brief overview, but I would invite every single one of you, if you have a deeper interest in the subject, to refer to my book, Beyond Bilal, Black History in Islam, as I have an entire chapter dedicated to the history of Islam in West Africa, where I explain how Islam enters into these regions. So before we even speak about this, I always like to bring this analogy up. The fact that Nigeria is one of Africa's 54 or so nations, and Nigeria has a population of over 200 million people. Some estimates are estimating it to be closer to 250 million. And with that population being majority Muslim, 50%, 50 to 60% of the population is Muslim. We can be generous and say 50%. Official statistics always say that Nigeria is 50% Muslim, 40% Christian, and 10% practitioners of traditional African religions. So if you take the number 200 million and divide it by 50%, that means that there are over 100 million Muslims in Nigeria, which make them one of the nations that have the largest amount of Muslims in the world. And if you were to add all of the GCC nations in the Arabian Peninsula, being Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Dubai, Kuwait, etc., together, they would equal roughly 40 million. So to look at that number in comparison, we can definitely say, or definitively say, there are more Nigerians in there are more Muslims in Nigeria than there are in the Arabian Peninsula. And so many people are surprised when they hear these statistics, and anybody who's been blessed to go to Nigeria will see not only a strong presence of Islam in the major cities like Abuja and Lagos, but in the north you'll find even emirates and remnants of a khilafah that once existed in Nigeria. And so today I want to give a brief overview of how Islam entered into the region and how Islam spread in the region, inshallah. And this would give a base for people to build upon in order for them to be able to um, expand their knowledge on the subject, inshallah. So, how did Islam enter into Nigeria? If we think about North Africa in comparison to West Africa, we realize that whilst North Africa was conquered by the Khilafah, so after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, in the time of Sayyidina Umar, we see that the North African territories of Egypt and Tunisia and Libya and even Morocco were brought under the control of the Khilafah. Whereas in West Africa, we never see the Arab conquest reach below the Sahara. So we never see Arabs coming into West Africa and ruling them or converting them or Arabizing them or turning them into Muslims. But what actually happened is in the early centuries of Islam, after the conquest of North Africa, the trade routes that had already been existing between West Africa and North Africa brought Islam into sub-Saharan Africa. So, for example, there were trade routes from Fezzan, there were trade routes from Tripoli, all of these places in North Africa, in Tunisia and those areas, and there were trade routes going from all of these North African countries into the kingdoms that existed in that area today. So, for example, when Islam entered Nigeria gradually before the arrival of colonialism through the trans-Saharan trade, not slave trade, but through the trans-Saharan trade, there was cultural exchange between the two groups, the North and the South. The Sahara wasn't a barrier, but it was a bridge that linked North Africa to West Africa. And so Muslim merchants and scholars, particularly Berbers and Tuaregs, traveled from Fezzan and Tripoli and even Timbuktu into the Sahel region, which is that region in West Africa. And they carried with them not only goods like books and salt and gold and cloth, but they also brought the Quran with them, and they brought Arabic literacy with them, and they brought Islamic values with them. And so the earliest Nigerian nation, and if we think about Nigeria today, Nigeria is an area that was created by Britain, and it was a colonial construct, and they just drew a box around the already existing kingdoms and empires. In the north, and we'll begin with speaking about the north because they received Islam first, and then I'll move into the south, into Yoruba land, and talk about how Islam spread there. But in the north, the first area is the northeastern area, which we now know today as Kanem and Borno, in the state that is now known as Maiduguri on the border to Cameroon and Niger, that area of Nigeria. They were the first people to receive Islam, and they received Islam within the first 200 years of the Prophet ﷺ passing away. So if the Prophet ﷺ passed away in the 600s, Islam entered into Nigeria in around the 800s, and people estimate that by the 9th century, seeing as Kanem, which was a powerful kingdom in northern Nigeria, was already trading with North Africa. We have Arab geographers like Al-Yaqubi and Idrisi mentioning the kings of Kanem and mentioning the fact that there was a Muslim presence there, and not only had Arabs and other people from that region settled in that region and intermixed with the people, but the natives had started to convert to Islam as well. But Islam initially only influenced the ruling classes and the traders and not the general population, because it was tied to commerce and diplomacy, in the sense that it was the rulers and the wealthy people who would receive Muslims, have to interact with them, have to learn their language in order to be able to trade with them. And through that, they were brought under the influence of Islam, and they saw Islam and Arabic language as a way of expanding their horizons and globalizing. And so many of them converted to Islam for that reason. So around the year 1085, the ruler of Kanem-Bornu, whose name was Mai Humayh ibn Abdul Jalil, he was the founder of the Safwa dynasty, and he was the one that really established Islam in that region. And these new rulers adopted Arabic titles, they built mosques, and then they also established embassies in Cairo and in Tripoli and in Mecca. So you can see then that this is the beginning of this international diplomacy between these areas. Not only were the kings of West Africa becoming Muslim, but they were establishing diplomatic relations with other Muslim nations outside of the Sahara in North Africa and even as far as Saudi Arabia. And we can see many different exchanges between the rulers of these different places. So the reign of the next king in Kanem, whose name was Dunama Dibalemi, and he ruled from the 1200s. He ruled around the 1200s. He expanded Kanem's influence into Fezzan and North Africa, and he strengthened the diplomatic and scholarly ties with the Muslim world. And he also encouraged the building of mosques and the establishment of Quranic schools. And so during that time in Kanem, Arabic became the language of record and scholarship. They produced the earliest Muslim judges, qadis, and katibs, and Islam started to spread through the elite and urban areas, whilst the rural populations retained traditional beliefs. So it was an interesting thing that we saw where Islam, as it was spreading in Nigeria specifically, saw it live alongside traditional West African beliefs. And this is something that was extremely strong and continues to be practiced in the South as well. And it wasn't until a much later period where Islam became the dominant religion in the north of Nigeria. And so after that, Kanem fell, and then towards the 14th century, they moved westward into Borno and they established a successor state called the Borno Kingdom or the Borno Empire. And that Borno Empire, which was also known as the Kanem-Bornu Empire, was deeply embedded in Islam by that time. They had already been practicing Islam for nearly half a millennium. And so Islam, alhamdulillah, was able to establish itself in northern Nigeria, and it did so as early as the 9th century. Then, when it comes to Hausaland now, the Hausaland was next to Kanem-Bornu. So the people of Kanem-Bornu were known as Kanuri people, whereas the people in Hausaland, which is the main section of northern Nigeria, were known as Hausa people. And Hausa land is extremely interesting because whilst the Kanuri people received Islam through North African traders who came in through and from Egypt and Tunisia and Libya through Chad and Sudan into Nigeria because of that area of the map that they were on the other side, the Hausa people mainly were influenced by Wangarawa traders. They called them Wangarawa, which means that they came from Wangara in Mali. And these were Soninke, Jahanke, and Sarahule, so all Mande speaking people or Mandinka people. And they were from the Mali Empire. So for those of us who know about the history of the Mali Empire, connected to Mansa Musa and Sunjata Keita and those rulers, Islam became established there around the 12th century. And then we started to see that they developed a scholarly class amongst the Manding who were responsible for studying and teaching the Quran, and not only that, but for spreading Islam throughout the West African region. And it was through these people that Islam spread in places like the Gambia, in Senegal, in Guinea, in Sierra Leone, and in other regions. And it was through them that Islam actually entered into Hausa land. So we see, for example, during the time of one of the rulers of Kano, there was a scholar called Abdul Rahman, and in the Kano Chronicle, they describe his name as Zaite, but we know that his real name was Jahate, which is a typical surname from amongst the Mandinka speaking people. This Abdul Rahman Jahate came in to that region with a group of people, and they influenced the king to convert to Islam. And the first king that was reported to have converted to Islam, for example, in Kano, was the king called Yaji, who ruled from the year 1349 to 1385. And so when he accepted Islam under the influence of these scholars from Mali, later on, subsequent kings decided to start to build masjids and build different centers of worship. And the Sultan or the king who strengthened Islam the most in that region, in the Kano region, as Kano was the most influential city in northern Nigeria around that time, was a king called Muhammad Rumfa, who ruled from 1463 to 1499. So with Muhammad Rumfa, he strengthened Islam's presence through administrative and moral reform, and he built Kano's great mosque and established Islamic courts. And he also invited scholars from North Africa to come and settle because they had been exposed to Islam for a longer period of time and they had access to greater amounts of knowledge in that time. And so he invited them to come and settle in his court and teach and preach Islam. And the most famous of those scholars was a man called Muhammad bin Abdul Karim al-Maghīlī from a city called Tlemcen in present-day Algeria. And he was born in the year 1440, and he was a Maliki jurist and theologian and reformer. And he traveled widely throughout West Africa. He didn't just come to that region, but he also traveled through Timbuktu, through Gao, and through Borno, as well as settling in Kano. So he visited Gao, which was the capital of the Songhai Empire at that time, and he met their king, Askia Muhammad Touré, and he advised him on Islamic government. And he wrote a book which was called Awjubat al-Maghīlī and As'ilat al-Askia, which was the answers that Maghili gave to the questions of Askia, who was questioning him about how to rule as a Muslim ruler. And so he was the one that wrote a lot of these manuals that the West African kings would use to rule their kingdoms according to Islam. And he urged him to rule by the Sharia and uphold justice, etc., and suppress un-Islamic practices within the region. In Kano, he traveled until he met Muhammad Rumfa, who was the king at that time, and he wrote a book for him as well called Tajuddin Fima Yajibu al Muluk, the crown of the religion in what is obligatory upon the kings. And so he advised them on how to rule according to Islam, how to establish qadis, how to purify, the beliefs of the people and construct mosques and provide support for scholars. And his ideas became essentially the intellectual foundation for Islamic reform in Hausaland, and his work circulated widely in Arabic and in Ajami, Ajami being the writing of West African languages in the Arabic script. And even later reformers, such as Usman and Fodio, who we'll speak about later, were influenced by Maghīlī's writings. So we can see then that Islam enters this region extremely early on. And even in the south, we also see Islam enter around the same time, at a slightly later date, but also around the same time. So Islam enters the Yoruba region, which is the southern part, in and around the 15th century. And it was also again through traders from the Mali Empire and even also traders from the north as well. So traders from Hausaland and Borno coming in and linking in towns like Ilorin and Oyo and Ife and Ijebu and settling in those places. And that's what led to people being exposed to Islam in those regions. But mainly it was the Wangara traders who were Julas and Soninkes and Mandinkas from Mali who brought in goods like cola nuts and textiles and horses, who also brought in Islam. And when they came, they used to settle in the courts of the kings. They would provide them with, goods and services, and also access to different things like medical and spiritual healing that they found very useful. And so many of the traditional kings actually converted to Islam. And even if you look in Yoruba land today, you'll see in most places like Ibadan and Ilorin and all of those areas, Oyo, most of the traditional kings are actually Muslim. Even until Lagos, most of the traditional kings in Lagos are also Muslim or were originally Muslim. One of the greatest actually strengtheners of Islam in that region was Ilorin, and Ilorin is in Kwara State, and Ilorin is like a bridge between northern Nigeria and Yoruba land. With Ilorin, it was a Yoruba majority area, but there was a sheikh called Sheikh Alimi, who was a scholar from Sokoto and was, linked to the Fulani scholarship in the north, who took over that region and established the dynasty that rules until today. And that Sheikh Alimi brought that northern Nigerian scholarship into Yoruba land and established it there in Ilorin. And Ilorin till today has produced most of the scholars that spread Islam in that region. And after the fall of the Oyo Empire, Muslim communities continued to multiply as more Hausa and Fulani traders resettled across the region, and traditional kings were converting to Islam and supporting the spread of Islam in that region as well. And so you see in many places like Oyo and Ibadan and Ijebu and even Lagos, most of the traditional rulers in those areas were Muslims, were in fact Muslims. And so Islam is a very, very major religion in that area. And so the last thing I want to talk about before I try and bring the session to a close is the Fulani Jihad and the Sokoto Khilafah. So by the 18th century, so this is the 1700s, and by this time, Islam has already been in Nigeria for roughly 800 to 700 years. Islam in Hausaland had become widespread, but it was diluted by a lot of local customs and political corruption. And there was a scholar called Shaykh Usman Fodio, who was descended from Senegalese immigrants who migrated into northern Nigeria. He began preaching reform, and he decided to preach Tawheed. He decided to revive the religion of Islam, and he began preaching in an area called Gobir in the year 1804. And when he started to preach, he was persecuted by local leaders because of the power that he wielded and the influence that he had. And so they actually attempted to assassinate him, and his followers. And when that failed, he launched a jihad, a war against the king of Gobir. He took over Gobir from the king, and then he continued to conquer the other Hausa and Nupe kingdoms, and even stretching into Ilorin and the different Fulani areas in Adamawa and even up to the borders of Kanem-Bornu, but he didn't conquer Kanem-Bornu. And he brought that entire area under his control, and he established himself as the Sultan. And so when he had taken over that area, he split the kingdom in between his son, Muhammad Bello, and his brother Abdullahi was an amazing scholar. And Sokoto became the capital under Khalifa Muhammad Bello, who was his son. And then Gwandu, which was another city, was where his brother Abdullahi would rule. And they divided the kingdom into over 30 emirates. So they placed in mostly areas where traditionally there would be a sarki or a king. They removed the house of king and replaced him with a Fulani emir. And there were over 30 emirates in the north, and they were all held under the authority of the Sultan in Sokoto and the other ruler in Gwandu. And then eventually the Gwandu section kind of died out and the Sultanate was focused on Sokoto. And until today, there's a Sultan, and until today, all of the emirates that were established also still exist. And not only did they establish political authority, but they produced so many books and so many writings, deep works of tafsir, of hadith, of scholarship of the highest quality that is equal to and even surpasses what could be found in the Arab world as well. Just recently, I was teaching the tafsir of Shaykh Usman dan Fodio's brother, Shaykh Abdullah dan Fodio, at Cambridge Muslim College during Ramadan, and I was able to go into some of the knowledge that was available there and some of the things that were available there as well. And then in the colonial era, the British came and they conquered Nigeria and created what we now know today as Nigeria in the 1900s. So the Sokoto Caliphate, for example, fell to British forces in the year 1903. But what the British did in Nigeria was interesting because they divided it into the north and the south. And they saw that the north had a sophisticated governmental system that was established by Usman dan Fodio and the Khilafah. And so what they did was, instead of removing it, they just applied indirect rule over it. And so the Sultan and the Emirs were still the rulers and still the authority. They just had to report to the British. Whereas in the south, they applied direct rule and they ruled directly in Yoruba land and in Igbo land as well. And so what this did was it allowed the North to keep that unique Islamic culture that they had. And until today, we still see, if we travel to Kano, if we travel to Kanem, if we travel to Sokoto, all the sultans and the emirs that we read about and we read their histories and we discussed here briefly are all still in place in those regions, and they're still ruling alongside the federal government, and they still have control, as well as the fact that 14 out of the 36 states of Nigeria, if that's the correct number, I'm sure it is, but you never know. Sometimes you make mistakes in estimating. Rule by Sharia and have Sharia courts. So in the north of Nigeria, there are actually states that rule by Sharia and they have Sharia courts, which are restricted to family and civil law, but nonetheless. And many Islamic schools called Islamia, as well as makarantas, which is where people study the Qur'an. And for many people in the north, they are not fluent in English, but they're fluent in the Arabic language because they went to Arabic-based schools. And so this is how the history of Islam was in Nigeria. This is how Islam entered in Nigeria. To give a brief overview, we see that in the 9th to the 11th centuries, northern Nigeria, such as Kanem-Bornu, become Islamized through trade and ties with Cairo and Tripoli. So Libya and Egypt, and then by extension Sudan and Chad, entering into that section of northern Nigeria and bringing Islam. Then later on in the 14th and 15th centuries, we see that traders coming in from the west, so Senegal and Mali, etc., influence Hausaland and convert them to Islam as well. And then the kings adopt the religion and help spread it amongst the people. In the southwest in Yoruba land, it was the 16th to 18th centuries in which traders from Mali again, and also traders from the north who had already been Islamized, were coming in and influencing again the elite and the traders to convert to Islam, which they did. And then in the 19th and 20th centuries, with the 19th century, we see the Jihad of Uthman dan Fodio, which establishes the Sultanate of Sokoto and the Khilafah. And then after that, with British colonization, we see the establishment of the Federal Republic of Nigeria after they become free from British colonization. And so we see that all of these influences are extremely interesting in that they show us that Islam is not new to Nigeria. From the 7th or 8th century. The earliest specific estimate that we can prove is the ninth, but we have suspicion to believe that even in the 8th century and possibly even in the 7th century, immediately after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, within the first 100 years of the Prophet ﷺ's mission, and there are even oral traditions that state that during the time of Sayyidina Umar bin Abdul Aziz, who was one of the earliest rulers in Islam, people were coming into northern Nigeria from his court. And that was within the first 200 years of the Prophet ﷺ passing away. But in the 7th to the 10th century, we see Islam comes in through trade, and that was Kanem's initial exposure. Then the 11th to 14th century, we see the Islamization of that Kanem-Bornu area, which then leads to the 14th and 18th centuries of the solidification of Islam in Hausaland. And then 18th to 19th centuries was the jihad. And then after that, we see the colonial era and post-independence, which brings us to where we are today, in which Islam is the majority religion in Nigeria. There are over 100 million Muslims in the country with a deep heritage and history that spans for nearly a millennia of interacting with Islam. And so hopefully that was a decent enough overview. You guys have learnt something, inshallah, I was able to support. And again, as I mentioned, if you refer to Beyond Bilal, Black History in Islam, there's an entire chapter on this subject which you can further do research on. It's very difficult to summarize the history of an entire nation in such a short space of time, but I hope I was able to contribute something to this amazing initiative. And I'll pass over, inshallah, to our able hosts and sign off, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair for speaking to us about such an amazing topic, Sheikh Mustapha Briggs. If you have any questions, could you put that in the chat, please? And because of time, I can only deliver about 3 questions at a time to the speaker. I think there's one.
Okay, we do have a question that has come in. So someone said, I heard that Uqba ibn Nafi still has a family in Nigeria and that he passed away there. Is this true?
So with Uqba bin Nafi, there are many myths and legends surrounding him and his relationship to. Oh, can you see me? Hold on.
No, we can't see you at the moment.
Let me try and turn the video. Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Can you see me?
Walaikum salam, yep, we can see you now.
So with Uqba bin Nafi, there are many claims. Um, Essentially, what I would say is, according to some scholars, Sheikh Usman dan Fodio, well, according to Sheikh Usman dan Fodio himself, he was a descendant of Uqba bin Nafi. So Uqba bin Nafi never made it to Nigeria, but his descendants traveled throughout West Africa and they intermarried into the Fulani people. And so there are many scholars from the Fulani ethnic group, and even into the Wolof ethnic group as well, such as Sheikh Uthman dan Fodio, um, Sheikh Omar Futi, Tal, Sheikh Ibrahim Nias, who claim descent from Uqba bin Nafi. So if the nasab can be verified, if the lineage of these people can be verified to Uqba bin Nafi, then we can say that yes, Uqba bin Nafi has descendants in Nigeria. The current Sultan of Sokoto would be a descendant of Uqba bin Nafi. Possibly many of the emirs of northern Nigeria would also be descendants of Uqba bin Nafi. And even as far as Senegal, the families of Sheikh Ibrahim Niass, the families of Sheikh Omar Futi Tal, the families of Malik C, and the families of many of the scholars in West Africa, Ahmadu Bamba would also be the Bekai Kunta. All of them would be descended from Uqba bin Nafi because he intermarried into the Fulani people.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. Someone also asked, can we hear more about the Ajami script?
Okay, so Ajami script essentially is just the practice of taking the Arabic alphabet and using it to write African languages. So Hausa and Fulani were written, and Kanuri were written in Arabic before the arrival of Islam, and these languages were oral languages that didn't have official alphabets. And when the Arabic language was it was introduced to the region, they learnt the Quran and they learnt how to read and write Arabic, and then they used those alphabets to read and write in their native languages. So this is interesting because this shows then Islam becoming a tool for the preservation of African heritage and culture, as opposed to when Western education came in and it kind of overruled traditional African culture. I'm sure if you question many of us who were raised in the Western education system and speak English, we can't speak our native languages as fluently as we can speak English. I definitely cannot. I can't speak my father's language at all, but I'm here speaking fluent English to you. And yeah, my Wolof is good on my mother's side, but my English is definitely better. So, with the practitioners of traditional Arabic education in Nigeria and in most places in West Africa, they are also extremely fluent in their native languages because they use the Arabic and the Arabic education system to preserve their native languages rather than to replace them.
Okay. We have another question that says, what's your insight of the tensions between the Northern Muslims and Yoruba Muslims, like in terms of leadership, practice, etc.?
My insight genuinely is just that these were two regions that were extremely separate. They didn't have any kind of interaction really before colonization outside of trade. And now we've all been forced to be one country together due to colonization and post-colonization. I can't really speak on the tensions in detail because I'm not from either of those regions in Nigeria. So I don't, I'll preserve my personal opinion, inshallah, and I won't have anything to say. I'll plead the fifth on that.
I'm not sure if this is a question you'd also like to answer, but someone's asking about the West labeling the Christian genocide, and what your opinion is on the Western narrative. So, what do you think of the situation right now?
Okay, so personally, I haven't done enough research to be able to give you guys a valid opinion. I'm still looking at news reports and studying and reading articles to know what exactly is happening. So I wouldn't feel comfortable answering that question because it's not something that I've mastered or have really good analysis on, unfortunately.
Okay, that's fair enough. So we have another question that says, I find it a bit strange that Sharia law was not implemented following the jihad in northern Nigeria around the time of Shaykh Usman and Fodio, but was only implemented in 2000. Why do you think this was?
That wasn't the case at all. Sheikh Usman dan Fodio's jihad was to implement Sharia law. That was the whole point of it. So it was implemented and then it was suppressed slightly under the British um, as they applied, colonial law to the region. And then in 2000, it was revived and brought back in cases of family law and civil law as well.
That's all we have for now because of time. So, thank you so much for answering all our questions. I'll pass it on to Halima.
Okay, so just a reminder that the next session, the next part of the series will be next Thursday, inshallah, also at 7 p.m. So please do join if you are available. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery and of learning. We pray that you found today's conversation both useful and inspiring, and just a reminder of the lessons of our past, um, in a way that we can action in our present, and a vision for a brighter future. A future where all communities can flourish, where we're all united, we're empowered, and we're serving together for the sake of Allah.
This work is only possible with your support. We can invite you to contribute to the Zamzam Foundation, supporting our mothers in Somalia. Stay connected by following our WhatsApp channel for updates on upcoming activities. Become a friend of the Muslim Council of Britain so you can follow us on Instagram. And because together we can make Vision 2050 a reality. Until next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'll pass the mic to Halima. She's going to recite Surah Al-Asr, and we're going to close the session.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم.